Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us to this really important meeting for us with Srécko Horvat. I am Petro Ionescu. I'm a playwright and theater director at Reactor. And I will make a short introduction of this project where we included this talk with Srécko Horvat. So it's a quite big cultural program that we have called Perspectives. And it's a multi-annual program. It's financed by the national administration, the administration of the National Cultural Fund. And it's a 2 years program. And for this program, we have a series of activities. And the big theme that we are trying to approach in this project is the future, and it's multiple perspectives on it. And for the beginning of this program, we thought that it would be a good idea to start with a debate, an important debate concerning the future, also from this social and political view. And yes, reinventing our future, it's the title, and we will see what we can do about this. I will also introduce Dana Domșodi and Sorin, who accepted our invitation to moderate this talk. They are both lecturers at the Faculty of Sociology and Social Work from Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca. They are both involved in the political scene in Romania and really active on the left movement here in Cluj and also in our country. And I will say just a couple of words about Srécko Horvat, who is an important author and philosopher from Croatia. And we are really happy to be able to make this talk with him. I think he's also an important figure, not only in the East European context, but globally. Also concerning the left movement nowadays. I will let him say more about himself. I think he does it better than I do. So thank you again, and I will pass the word to Dana and Sorin, who will moderate. Thank you.
So, hi everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Petro and the entire team from Reactor for making this event possible. Both me and Dana are very happy about this opportunity to have a discussion with Srécko tonight. The format of this event will be the following. In the first 30-40 minutes, we will kindly ask our guests to talk about a few themes that we think are relevant for our present situation. And in the second part, which will last about an hour, we will open the conversation for Q&A, and we hope that you can all intervene and be part of this discussion. So, Srécko, thank you very much for being here with us. We know you have a very busy schedule and that you travel all over the world. You just told us about your trip to Mexico. I would like to start by asking you about your political background. We know that you grew up during the 90s in Croatia, where you graduated in philosophy and linguistics, and you experienced firsthand the horrible Yugoslav wars and the ethnic cleansing that was going on there, and of course later on the capitalist reform. And I think the first post-socialist decade in the former Yugoslavia was maybe one of the most turbulent periods in the region. It was tough for everyone in Central and Eastern Europe during that time, but particularly for former Yugoslavia. And I would like to ask you, how did you experience these events growing up? How did they shape your political views and your political thinking?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this beautiful first question. And let me first, before I start answering to the question and before we have, an exchange of ideas as well, thank to Petro and Reactor in Cluj for inviting me, for doing this exciting event, and also to you and Dana for leading the conversation today. It's really my honor, and I'm glad to see so many people here with us. So regarding the question, well, I was born in a country which doesn't exist anymore. As you all know, this is socialist Yugoslavia. I was born there and I'm sorry for being a bit more personal now at the beginning, but it might contextualize my, how to call it, political subjectivation, I would call it like that. And later we can speak more theory and philosophy and all other topics. But for the context, I was born in 1983, but I didn't live in socialist Yugoslavia. I actually returned just when the war started. I was living as a child of a political refugee from Yugoslavia who got political asylum in Germany, in Munich. That was my father, who spent a few years in prison in Yugoslavia in the 80s when I was born. So we couldn't actually return to Yugoslavia. So my childhood, I was actually, which kind of, it can also be interesting. I grew up in a capitalist system in Germany of the 80s, just before the Berlin Wall fell down. And I returned to Croatia in 91, which was a very interesting period. So I was around, let's say, 8 years old at that time. And actually that was the start, not just of the war, which would last for several years in some of the countries, even more. The consequences we still live today. I mean, from the discourse of nationalism, hatred between different nationalities of the post-Yugoslav space, to war criminals who still walk freely in some cities, in all of these countries, in Serbia, in Croatia, and so on. So we are still living these consequences of the war, but it wasn't just the war. Together with the war, I mean, it was a typical example of what Naomi Klein would probably call a shock therapy, you know, a shock therapy in the sense that you have a big shock, which is a huge catastrophe, which is socialist Yugoslavia falling apart. And I would call it a civil war between the former republics of socialist Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansing, genocide, I mean, everything what you can imagine. It was really, I mean, Sarajevo was the longest siege of a city since the Second World War. So in the middle of Europe, 1 hour flight to Vienna, 1 hour flight to Rome, 1.5 hours to Frankfurt or Berlin, there was a war going on just as Europe was, European Union, not Europe, was celebrating, you know, unity, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of socialism. Well, in our countries, it didn't go so well as in some other former, mainly Soviet republics. At the same time, I think what is most interesting for my political subjectivation isn't just the nationalism which existed in the 90s, where you as a young boy were, you know, we were bombarded daily in Croatia, in Serbia. They were also daily bombarded with a counter narrative, with this sort of glorification of the finally reborn nation state of Croatia. Then, of course, inventing, which you could have seen best in one of the other former republics, which is closer to Romania, in Macedonia, for instance. You know, this retreat to a mythology which goes back thousands of years, maybe even in the case of Macedonia. And in Croatia also, it had this kind of retreat in order to rebuild the national identity and in order to make a difference from all other national identities, whether it's the Slovenians, the Serbs, everyone who was around. We needed, I mean, not we, those who were building the Croatian nation state in the 90s, you needed this kind of mythology, which is a kind of Blut und Boden mythology, you know. It's a kind of also purification of the nation state from other elements of the nation state. In some cases, it took the form of ethnic cleansing, because what you need when you build a nation state is, of course, the same language, the same nation, the same religion, all those things which during socialist Yugoslavia were, to a certain degree, until the fall of Yugoslavia, of course, living side by side. I mean, if you look at Sarajevo or Bosnia and Herzegovina before the war and before the collapse of socialist Yugoslavia, it would be a model for those multiculturalist wet dreams, you know. Although I'm not really a proponent of multiculturalism, I have problems with that as well. but in the sense that you had 3 religions, several nationalities, you had Catholic churches, mosques in the same place. The language was a kind of shared language. I mean, it's one language, although I'm a minority to claim that today. So in the 90s, it was pretty interesting to grow up in this context. For me, it was also difficult because when I came to Germany, I was perceived as a Gastarbeiter child, which means a foreigner. When I returned from Germany to now Croatia, not Yugoslavia anymore, I was again perceived as a foreigner, as a German, you know. So at the beginning of my childhood, I had certain problems of fitting in, and I would rather fit out, actually, in a way. And then for me, I would say, you know, looking in retrospective, the moment of a sort of political subjectivation in that hell, I would say. I mean, I had the luck, I was living in the north of Croatia, in a small city called Čakovec, closer to the Hungarian border. So we didn't really feel or have this kind of experience as other children, you know, in other cities. But, you know, regularly fighter jets were flying above the city. We would have to escape in the basement. Then in the basement, so I was like, I would say 9-10 years old or something like that. It wasn't yet political subjectivation, but it was my first experience of some more collective socialization. You know, which me as a child in socialist Yugoslavia didn't have because I went to Germany. But it was still, I mean, the name of our street, of our building was Vladimira Bakaric 28. Vladimir Bakaric was a famous partisan, so they still didn't change the street names in 91. And in the basement, while we had this, you know, we had to stay there for a few hours, we had this kind of socialization among the kids, which was a kind of, Foucault would call it heterotopia, in a real nightmare, during a dystopia, where you as a child, you didn't have to go to school, you had fun and blah, blah, blah. But that still wasn't political subjectivation, although politics was all around. You couldn't escape it, you know, you could cut the air, how thick it was with nationalism, with different narratives, you know, with pictures every day from the war, stories of people who lost someone and so on. So in that sense, it was difficult and a bit nightmarish, of course. But then me as a child, I found punk and hardcore, and that saved my life. And it also it was my first political subjectivation, in the sense that, you know, first you start to listen to music, which is more often in English. Of course, we had our own bands. I started to play in a hardcore band as well, which also helped because for the first time, I was like 15 or something, we traveled across some of the former republics, having concerts, for instance, in Slovenia or in other parts of Croatia after the war, where you would have a growing scene of punk hardcores, children mainly, teenagers, which is an interesting thing. It would bring, we can talk about it later, what is the current subjectivation or political subjectivation of teenagers or children today, you know? Is there such a scene which involves, you know, a kind of movement of teenagers, which involves music, radical politics, because what we were doing, and me and my friends, we were, you know, doing do-it-yourself DIY. We would publish our own fanzine, which, you know, you're 15 and you publish your own magazine. It's quite an experience, which later was quite useful for me, or the experience of, you know, organizing concerts. So you would have to, we were still sending letters, you know, by written. I know I received a demo tape by System of a Down, for instance, to whom I sent a letter. They were still a small band, and they sent a demo tape to an idiot in Croatia, a teenager. And then we were sharing, you know, these tapes. We were self-publishing. Then we were starting to translate Peter Kropotkin, Bakunin. It was mainly anarchists, but also Chomsky at that point. Chomsky was at that point much more important for us politically than later I would find out when I was studying linguistics, that there is another part of Chomsky as well. So I would say in the mid-90s, because you have to understand the context, I still remember when I came first to I think it was high school. So in the schools, this is just an illustration of post-socialist space. There were books mainly by Marxists, of course, in the classroom. So Plekhanov, Marx, of course, and so on. And one day the teacher said, okay, you can take any book you want, you can take it home, which was a more peaceful way of getting rid of books, because at the beginning of the 90s, I don't know whether you know, but most of the books which were connected not just to Marxism, but also to, you know, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, because Russia, that means communism, definitely. Yeah, it's all the same. They were getting rid of the books. They were just throwing them out of libraries. And then usually it was the Roma people who would pick it up. I mean, half of my book collection, not here because I'm just at, you know, at another place, mainly in boxes, comes from flea markets where the Roma people would actually save the Marxist anarchist literature and you could buy it cheaply. So that was this period of the 90s, beginning of the 90s, where, you know, Marxism was not just removed, but also there was a cleansing into the dustbin of history. And the teenagers were kind of finding out me as well, you know, a kind of critical discourse, critical theory before we found out about critical theory, Frankfurt School and so on. It was mainly those writers, revolutionaries, practitioners, to put it like that, who were our influence in the mid-90s and who kind of helped us both to navigate between nationalism on the one hand and to build a kind of anti-nationalist stance or theory. And on the other hand, from this kind of official Marxism, to put it like that. Because of course, we'll speak about it later, as Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia was reaching its collapse, basically Marxism became a joke, of course, in the sense that, you know, every classroom had, you know, Plekhanov, Marx, you can just imagine. But of course, the teenagers in high school cannot understand these words. I remember I took a Plekhanov book home with, I think, 16 or something. I didn't understand shit. But that was the ideology, you know, obviously at the end of Yugoslavia. And it would be interesting to talk maybe a bit later about also the period of Yugoslavia where you had, for instance, I don't know how much you are aware of it in Romania, the Praxis School and the Corčula Summer School, which was, you know, an attempt to criticize real existing socialism from a more radical perspective, from a socialist perspective. And then these movements were, you know, censored. The magazine of Praxis was shut down. That was the 70s. And later, some of them, of course, of these leftists became nationalists. I mean, which is, I guess, quite a parallel also with Romania and other countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, how quickly parts of the intelligentsia from leftists turned into nationalists. But yeah, I'm going too far, so I'll stop here. I mean, that was kind of the 90s for me, but there's many more.
Yes, Srécko, this is very interesting. Like in the early 90s, I lived in Germany for a while as well, and I had many Bosnian friends. They were all there, refugees with their families without fathers, and it was like a terrible emotional experience every time when they told me that their father died. They were expecting news from the front, and they were devastated by this. It was a horrible period. So thank you very much for sharing this, also sharing about the punk scene. This is very interesting. I would like to ask you very, very briefly about your university period. Like when you went to Zagreb University, was that a more leftist environment? Did you get there in touch with more leftist, progressive, Marxist perspectives?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I had the luck that I enrolled university in 2001. And that was still kind of a period where, at least at the Faculty of Philosophy, which was usually always left, and where some former Praxis philosophers were still teaching. So some of the old guard, to put it like that. So that was definitely, I had the luck to study with some of them. And the same at the Department of Linguistics, because I think the Department of Linguistics in Zagreb was pretty strong, especially on the one hand when it came to the reconstruction of Indo-European languages. So this kind of philology, but, you know, trying to understand through a kind of structuralist way, not just the origin of language, but how it influences our current languages, cultures, mythologies, and so on. But also the structuralist, post-structuralist wave, to put it like that, you know, from De Saussure to Roland Barthes. and in between many others, that was really inspiring for me. So it was still kind of a left environment, I would put it like that, especially compared to other faculties. And for me, I again was lucky that parts of my generation, whether they had this kind of same experience, I don't know, of the 90s, but many of them did, whether, you know, to be part of the punk hardcore scene or to be a skater or doing graffiti or whatever. There were people who were kind of on the verge, we would call it the alternative, you know, they were kind of, you know, sort of a grassroots movements which was not fully aware of itself and it wasn't yet political. But then at the university, I would say people became aware also of, for instance, in the 2000s, gradually after the transition period of the 90s, transition from real existing socialism to real existing capitalism. You know, in the 90s, what was first privatized during the shock therapy was the factories, infrastructure, banks, the financial sector. For instance, more than 90% of the banks today in Croatia are French, German, Italian banks, and so on. So that was all happening in the 90s. Coca-Cola coming to Bosnia, water, so privatizing water sources. I mean, they call it concession, so they get it for 50 years, but it's basically privatization. So all of that was happening in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, when I came to university, they gradually start to grab the other infrastructure, you know, healthcare, which is gradually also is still not privatized in Croatia, but if you want good healthcare service, you will go to a private doctor, as with many other things. Education, slowly it was also, you know, during socialist Yugoslavia, education was completely for free for everyone. And actually, if you were from parts of the country, you know, which is not that developed, you would have some benefits if you come to the city and study and so on. Housing was, we had social housing, and healthcare was, of course, for free. What happens after the 90s, of course, is huge real estate investment, which still lasts to today. I mean, the prices of flats and real estate in Croatia is completely mad, in Serbia as well. Unlike, I'm just giving you the contrast, unlike the socialist Yugoslav period where you had social housing. Then healthcare, the same in all of the former republics. It's slowly or rapidly going into completely private ownership. And education. So when the privatization of education started to happen in Croatia, at the Faculty of Philosophy, we started a movement. I was part of it, which was, you know, a pretty horizontal movement at that time. That was much before Occupy Wall Street. It was also before the Chilean. I mean, you can see now the good news from Chile and Gabriel Boric becoming the president. He was a student leader for a similar reason. You know, it would be interesting to compare post-socialist Yugoslavia and Chile. And what kind of reforms happened during Pinochet, and because basically what they were fighting against is private education as well in 2011, with all the differences. But that was 2011 in Croatia. That happened a few years earlier, also before Occupy Wall Street, which I think is pretty interesting because the discourse, the narrative, the kind of organizing was very similar. It was in principle the idea of direct democracy. So we were occupying the Faculty of Philosophy in Zagreb for more than a month, which means people were sleeping at the faculty. We were blocking the entrance. And not only that, every day there was a plenum, which means a general assembly, every day with more than 1,000 people participating every day at the General Assembly. There was an alternative educational program. So basically we took over the whole building of the Faculty of Philosophy and had various programs, you know, from philosophy, critical theory, dance, linguistics, whatever, concerts, everything. And we went into a direct clash with the Ministry of Education and the government at that time, which was pretty funny at that time, I would say, now looking in retrospective, because we didn't have leaders, or we always said, you know, it's direct democracy, so each time you have a kind of exchange of representatives. And for TV and mainstream politicians, that was something which they really didn't understand, you know, because they want to speak to a person with a name and a face and so on. So it was an interesting political experiment. And here I finished just before announcing where it went, because I know that we will talk about it later. I would say that was a very important moment in, not just for me personally, because it happened when I was studying, but also for Croatia and in other countries, Slovenia, Serbia, with a difference in years, you could follow a similar trend, you know, that this political radicalization, political subjectivation of students who were fighting against the privatization of education, a few years later came to how to put it, it realized itself in something very concrete. So there are different directions of the student movement in Croatia. One of them, many people who were part of the student movement and who were part of the Right to the City movement, which was happening at the same time. So on the one hand, a struggle against the privatization of education, and on the other hand, a struggle against the privatization of urban space, you know, all those shopping malls and everything, privatizing public space, that was happening at the same time. 12, 13 or something years later, for the first time after the collapse of Yugoslavia, the capital of Yugoslavia, Zagreb, has a left-green mayor, Tomislav Tomašević, who was elected, I think, in May this year. And many people who are involved in this Možemo movement and a coalition which was built around it were either part of the student movements 12, 13 years before, or the Right to the City movement. So you can actually follow, you know, not only a continuation, but also a growing of a movement which went into different directions, of course. Some went more in the anarchist direction, some went more into a hardcore Marxist position, and some went more in this kind of green left for the 21st century, which we can discuss what it actually means and so on. But yeah, it's not a short answer, I'm sorry.
No, Srécko, thank you very much for bringing up these issues. They relate very much to my second topic, my second question, which has to do with capitalist transformations in post-socialist countries. Like, we already have now 3 decades of capitalism in this region. And when we look back at what happened, we realize that there has been a varieties of capitalism implemented in the region. Like, while these reforms were taking place, most of the people were talking about the alternative between state socialism and free market capitalism. But the story was much more complex, because on one hand, we had countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic state that implemented hardcore neoliberal reforms. And you had countries as Slovenia, for example, where this capitalist transition was embedded in very specific types of welfare policies. And my question to you would be, how exactly did Croatia experience this transition to capitalism? What were the main dislocations generated by capitalism in Croatia? And here I would like to refer to the book you wrote together with Žižek, which was translated into Romanian. And there you talked about how capitalism is leading to a disaster. And my specific question to you would be, like, what types of disasters have capitalism generated, not in general, but in post-socialist countries?
Well, to answer this complex question, I think, again, we have to go back to what went wrong, to put it like that, in socialist Yugoslavia. I mean, some things obviously went wrong, and especially on the economic level. And this economic level, as we always know, very often has consequences on the social fabric of a society, and very often can lead to nationalism. And that would be my point, you know, that unlike the usual interpretation of the fall of Yugoslavia, which says that Yugoslavia fell apart because of different sorts of nationalism, because of hatred between the different nations, I would say that socialist Yugoslavia already collapsed even before the war. And that it actually caused the war, to put it like that. The collapse of Yugoslavia, before the real collapse of Yugoslavia, caused the bloody war. And what do I mean by that? The problem, I think, I mean, it started much earlier, of course. Darko Suvin, for instance, wrote some important stuff on it, also in English. Boris Budan as well. There are now also parts of my generation, Gal Kirn, for instance, and some others are also dealing with these topics in different ways, is that, already in the 50s, I mean, immediately after the Second World War, of course, you had a creation of something which would become a new elite in socialist Yugoslavia. Whether it's the political nomenclatura, whether it meant that only by having, being a member of the Communist Party, you could get a better job and this kind of stuff, that was already happening. But unlike many other socialist republics, mainly Soviet ones, socialist Yugoslavia was really specific because it had the self-management project, which meant that at least in theory, the surplus value wasn't going to some big fat capitalist, Jeff Bezos or whoever, but it was going back to the workers, and that you had democracy in the context of work, which I think is a very important, economic democracy, that in theory, the workers could decide on the future of their work, or how the factory, with whom it will cooperate, how much it will be invest or whatever. So I think that was definitely special for socialist Yugoslavia, this sort of self-management, which was later rediscovered in Latin America. And when we were doing the Subversive Festival, we had, for instance, Michael Lebowitz or some others, whether from Venezuela, Cuba, and so on, who said, look, we were studying self-management in the 70s or in the 80s because it was so inspiring for us. And then later, of course, it was completely forgotten or, thrown away into the dustbin of history. And for 10, 20 years, no one was speaking about it. It was perceived as something bad. So self-management also was good in theory, but in practice, it had certain problems. But I would say that the final kick for socialist Yugoslavia was actually the major economic crisis of the 70s and the oil crisis. And what started to happen then is that Croatia, Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia started to take the first loans, both from the US, later from the IMF. It is not really known that just 1 month after Tito died, so that's the 1980, socialist Yugoslavia took the biggest loan from the International Monetary Fund in the history of the International Monetary Fund until then. So it took several loans from the International Monetary Fund from the 70s to the mid-80s. And of course, the International Monetary Fund, like the European Commission, like the Troika, doesn't give you money without asking anything in return. And what they ask in return, of course, is structural adjustments. And this is not really a topic many many scholars of socialist Yugoslavia deal with. There is a great PhD dissertation by Jake Lowinger, who did it under Giovanni Arrighi, which is about the workers' strikes in Yugoslavia from the 80s to the 90s. So basically, I mean to simplify this picture and then to come to the 90s and your question about Croatia, but I think it's really necessary to understand it. After the loans, after the financial crisis of Yugoslavia itself, which tried to stabilize itself by taking loans from major world financial institutions, in the 80s and the 90s, you already have, before the collapse of socialism, before the introduction of capitalism, you already have structural adjustments. So you basically already have people losing their jobs, the industry specializing into something else, so you can just get rid of people and so on. And I think the amount of worker strikes from 80s to the 90s is really shocking. It's thousands of worker strikes which are happening those years. And what is interesting, all those worker strikes were not nationalist yet. They were Bosnians, Serbs, people from Kosovo, Croatia, Slovenia protesting together against the privatizations which already happened before the collapse of Yugoslavia, against the structural reforms. And at that time, in a time of an economic crisis, which I think is a nice parallel, that's something we write about, I think, if I remember well, in the book, What Does Europe Want with Žižek. It's a nice parallel with the possible collapse of the European Union, where you have an economic crisis, where you have structural adjustments, continuous shock therapy now for decades already. Then, of course, that you have more frustration, more fear, people who are unemployed, people who don't have money to send their kids to school or to faculty or whatever. And then at that time, it's the best time for the arrival of, well, today we would call them populists, but and you can see that they arrived precisely at those critical moments in history. But at that time, it was nationalist, whether it's Franjo Tuđman, Slobodan Milošević, others who used this, I would say, this stress, this agony, which was created by the economic crisis and by the structural reforms, which used this energy to channel it into nationalism. So at the end of the 80s and the 90s, I mean, everything is already ready for the war. And when the war starts to happen, here I'm coming to your question. What happens is the perfect conditions that a lumpen bourgeoisie, as Günther Anders would call it, or a comprador elite takes over the basic infrastructure of the country. And what does it mean? You know, it means that you have a national, let's call it like that, a national elite. We call them tycoons and so on. I mean, that was this simplified term later, who is cooperating with the foreign bourgeoisie, to put it in old Marxist terms, in order to plunder the state assets, you know, because what is specific for socialist Yugoslavia and for the transition period is that we didn't just have private property and state property, we also had social property. So we had three sorts of property. And then first what happened in the transition period is that the social property was turned into state property, and those who governed the state, this comprador elite or lumpen bourgeoisie, helped either to put basically helped the privatization property of the state property. So you had from social property into state property, from state property those who own the means of production now, to private property. And very often that was the process of either selling off a lot of infrastructure to foreign companies, foreign capital, or both, sell it to foreign capital and put some money into your own pocket. And this transition period is still going on. I mean, that's the thing. It's still going on. I would say it was to a certain degree similar to even to Slovenia, you know, and other countries. Only the form of capitalism took, I would say, different forms. You know, in Croatia, for instance, you had this constant exchange between two main parties, the Conservative Party and the Social Democratic Party, while in Serbia during the last decade you just have one leader and a much more autocratic form of capitalism, I would say. So that's the basic difference. But the similarities, just to end, is the infrastructure, factories, shipyards, that's all taken over already. The banking system as well, no financial sovereignty at all for those countries. Indebtment, which is several times bigger than the indebtment of Yugoslavia at its time of collapse. And now they're going for education, healthcare, media, yes, and everything else.
Okay, Srécko, I have only one last question and I will hand over to Dana, and maybe you can give us a brief answer to this question. And it relates to your political activism, which is very impressive. You've been involved with the Subversive Festival, which was one of the and still is one of the most important hub of critical thinking and activism in Central and Eastern Europe. Also, you're one of the co-founder of the M25, a project with which the Romanian public is very familiar. So in the last 2 decades, you've been in contact with a lot of leftist hubs, leftist platforms. And I would like to ask you about the state of the left in the region, like in this volume which you co-edited in 2015 called Welcome to the Desert of Post-Socialism, you talk there about, and I quote, the return of radical and emancipatory politics in our region. And I would like to ask you to give us a very brief overview of how the post-socialist left looks in Central and Eastern Europe, and tell us what it's radical about the politics that this leftist group support.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, although the question is also complex. Well, I would say that, you know, after the collapse of Yugoslavia, it was very difficult to publicly claim that you even belong to the left, because to say that publicly was almost a sort of public suicide, because it was a very dirty word which they tried to make even more dirtier, you know. Socialist Yugoslavia, in the interpretation of Croatia, in Serbia it was different, was identified with Serbia, it was identified with the war, and basically they tried to get rid of all the positive aspects of socialist Yugoslavia, of course, which is the anti-fascist struggle, the non-aligned movement, self-management, and so on. So in that context, it was pretty difficult to be openly left. I would say when it starts to change is that period of the student occupations and right to the city movement, when this kind of, I would say, new left, new green movement was actually born. And that book, which you mentioned, was written then, 10 years ago, I would say. But if I remember it well, the main point was that a sort of new radical politics is being born, and that this sort of new radical politics would have an effect on even mainstream politics, which at that time it didn't have, not at least not in that degree, you know. 10 years later, what you can see, I'm talking now mainly about post-socialist Yugoslavia. I don't know that much about other countries. And I'm really happy to learn about it, because I think there are parallels. So 10 years later, after this book was published, and the thesis that this student movement and you know, these anti-gentrification movements will lead to a new sort of politics. What you had first, you had it in Slovenia with Levica, which is in translation the left. So it's for the first time that in an ex-Yugoslav socialist country, a left party enters parliament. They're still in parliament. Some of them are my good friends. They're also part of the Progressive International and other movements. And well, they are fighting Janez Janša in a very difficult situation in Slovenia, which is really going into the, it's already in the urbanized, it's already in the direction of Orban and this kind of proto-fascist form of social relations, I would say. So you had Levica, which was also influenced by different social movements. In Croatia, as I said already, you had the biggest victory so far in post-socialist countries in elections. We're just talking about electoral politics, of course, at the moment. You had Možemo, other parties, Nova Ljevica, which means the new left, Radnička fronta, the workers' front. You had, out of this movement, you had the creation of several radical parties, I would say, whether they are more Marxist, more green, or so on. There are differences between them. But for the first time this year, this kind of coalition, influenced, of course, by Barcelona and Pomu and other movements which already exist in Europe, succeeded to get to power in the capital of Zagreb, which so far, I mean, I'm hopeful, but it carries a lot of difficulties after you get to power in a city which for 20 years, so that's 2 decades, was governed by a corrupted mayor who was neither left, neither right. He was really just, you know, a kind of mafiosi guy who privatized most of the infrastructure of the city or gave it to the mafia, basically, to govern it and so on. So it's a very difficult situation for our comrades who are governing Zagreb today. But I would say that was a direct influence how in the last 3 decades, as you described them, of this kind of post-socialist desert, that there is not just hope anymore, but there are real attempts to govern, you know, which is a huge thing. At the same time, and here I stop, but I find it a very interesting situation also in the global context. I don't know how much you followed what was happening in Serbia during the last weeks, which is very interesting. Because of course there the situation is much more difficult for any left, I would say. First of all, because Milosevic kind of kidnapped socialism from socialism itself. His party was called Socialist Party, that didn't have to do anything with socialism. Second, because Vučić, of course, is governing in a very autocratic way, so you don't have the situation that you have that you can appear on mainstream media or whatever, present your political program. No, there is only one party there which can be in the mainstream. And what started to happen is, first of all, a creation, of course, at the same time when we had the occupation of faculties in Zagreb, and the student movement. There was also a student movement in Serbia, also Don't Drown Belgrade, Ne Davimo Belgrad, which is a movement mainly focused on to stop the privatization of urban space. And now comes the interesting thing with the green transition globally. Serbia found huge reserves of lithium. Actually not lithium, but a mineral which is used to create lithium and which is then used for electric batteries, so that, you know, the rich Germans and French can drive electric cars and then export the diesel cars to the periphery. And then a big company, Rio Tinto, comes to Serbia and wants to basically destroy a huge part of both nature, but you know, the living conditions of people and so on. And now what you had a few weeks ago is that different movements came together. I mean, from grassroots movements, more socialist movements. It's a mixture. It's very heterogeneous. And they blocked the whole country. Basically, they blocked the whole country. They blocked the highways, they blocked bridges, and all what they asked is for the government to stop this investment. Nominally, in the meantime, who knows what will happen later. I'm a bit always skeptical because they have smart leaders, to put it like that. In the meantime, the government decided to stop the project, but I don't think it's the end. And it will be very interesting next year in spring when there will be elections. I think both on the local level for a city such as Belgrade, but also on the national level in Serbia. So I think Serbia is next when it comes to this wave of previous social movements forming political parties and the political parties entering, whether it's the local level or national level. So that's just brief.
Yes. Thank you, Srécko. I will hand over to Dana now.
Okay, thank you for your answers, and I will take over from Sorin. First of all, before addressing my questions, I would also like to thank Petro, but also the team from Reactor for inviting me to co-moderate this event. And also I'm very honored by this opportunity to have a conversation with you, Srécko, and hearing also the reactions from the public. Regarding these last responses that you gave, but also coming back a bit or coming into the present, to our present emergency, the COVID pandemic, I would also have some questions, especially because I saw that one of your latest book, it's Everything Must Change, the World After COVID-19, that you, it's a collective volume that you co-authored with Renata Avila, and you again discussing the pandemic there, you connect the question of the COVID-19 pandemic with the failures and the contradictions of the capitalist mode of production, discussing also how the issue of the pandemic intertwines with the three big E's of capitalism: exploitation, extraction, and expansion of capital. And from this question, but also opening up the discussion in a way that converges with the theme of the project from Reactor, I would also like to ask you, from your perspective, what kind, if any, historical, revolutionary, let's say, although revolutionary is such a big word, opening does it harbor, the pandemic, if any, and in what way the critique of the political economy or I don't know, critical theory in general can push through with renewed arguments, given the mismanagement, the global mismanagement of the pandemic, or at least the unequal management of the pandemic has demonstrated, towards maybe another global economic organization, and what types of collective actions and organizations, both institutionally but also from below, can bring this about. And I'm asking you these questions because I saw, looking through this book that has this dialogical structure, and it's a conversation, the chapters are actually conversation, and it's a pooling of ideas and from all sorts of parts of the world, from all sorts of intellectuals. If maybe you can get into the details regarding a future world after the pandemic, and in what way this future can maybe, I don't know, a new type of capitalism, or maybe post-capitalist, or maybe it's too optimistic to think like this. I don't know if you can just elaborate a bit on the future of a post-pandemic world.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and thanks for joining the conversation and for the beautiful question. Well, I'll start from the book, which you just mentioned, Everything Must Change, which was created out of utter desperation, I would say, because first what we created in the first pandemic period was with the Democracy in Europe movement. We created something what we called DMTV, which was basically me sitting in a room in Vienna, not being able to exit my apartment, and just calling different people around the world. Even David Graeber, that was one of his last interviews, I would say, because I think it happened in April and he died a bit later. Many people were part of it, and I think it's interesting because I didn't open the book since then. So after this live TV shows, this kind of Zooms, we were using Zoom, of course, which were transmitted live, and the idea was actually to bring people together in a moment when everyone was isolated and everyone was going through something completely new. I mean, none of us has the experience of the Spanish flu. Maybe someone in Yugoslavia has still the experience of smallpox, but for our generation, it was definitely the first time that we were living through a pandemic. Now, if I would look at the book, probably, I mean, I'm interested what you see. Probably what I would see is a lot of hope at that beginning, you know, in the sense that, you know, that was just the start, what, I think April, May 2020. First, it was for all of us the first lockdowns where, you know, at the beginning, even now, if you think about it, we can be a bit nostalgic towards it. You know, finally, I have enough time. I'm at home. I will do what, read everything I wanted to read, cook as much as I want, not go to job, and so on. But then very soon, especially people who had children at that time, were going rather crazy because they saw what's the meaning and the value of kindergarten, for instance, or other people taking care of your kids. And here we come, you know, to the more political side of your question. I think pretty quickly it became visible that those who suffer the most are the care workers, in every sense. You know, speaking about care, for instance, if you take the number of Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, and other care workers who work in Austria, or the Romanian, Serbian, Croatian, and so on workers who work in the agricultural sector in Germany, for instance, picking up asparagus and so on, you would have seen that there is a big clash, which for me was, and for you as well, I guess, always obvious that there is a big clash between the center of the European Union and the periphery of the European Union. But now with the pandemic, I think, and that's why I use the term apocalypsis in the Greek sense of the world, it was a kind of revelation, you know, where the masks have fallen and suddenly everything, the exploitation was so visible to everyone, actually, you know. If you are a worker from the periphery, you can sleep in a room with 10 people, you don't have to isolate. Who cares? As long as the next day you will work in our fields and the next day supermarkets will be full of asparagus. I mean, it sounds a bit brutal, but I think that was the reality. And you could have seen something very similar in other countries, you know, if you looked at the UK, for instance, where for the first time, I think this clapping was invented, you know, this kind of fake solidarity, I would say, or inability to actually enact any kind of better solidarity at that moment. So I would say that was, I still find some hope in this historic moment, in the sense that as much as different parts of the world are differently developed or differently suffered through this crisis and various connected crises, from the climate change to different, all sorts of crises, I would say not for the first time, but in our recent life, there was a unifying texture, a unifying fabric, which was kind of shared around the world, you know, that we are living in a very special moment, that we are living in a moment where everything will change. Of course, 2 years later, we can see that everything changed so that everything can stay the same, which is this famous quote which we use in the book by Lampedusa and later by Visconti, in the sense that if you just look who are the biggest pandemic profiteers, you will see it's people like Jeff Bezos. If Jeff Bezos paid, I think, a bonus of $680,000 to each of his workers, and he has more than 1 million workers, he would stay of the same richness as he was before the pandemic. So can you imagine that if he pays more than $600,000 to more than 1 million workers, Amazon would be at the same line as before the pandemic. It just shows how the accumulation of capital, thanks to the pandemic, actually, was created, because it's Amazon, it's Silicon Valley who are using the pandemic in the best possible way. Because if you have the blockage of supply chains, of course, that those companies which created platforms for transport, whether it's food, products, humans, whether it's, you know, Uber, Deliveroo, Amazon, and so on, that this will be the biggest pandemic profiteers. So I would say it's nearly not the end of capitalism, although some of other thinkers, even my friend Yanis Varoufakis, for instance, claims that we are reaching the end of capitalism and going into the direction, or that we are already in the phase of what he calls techno-feudalism. I agree on the point about new sorts of feudalism, in the sense that what Yanis says, that you don't anymore have this classical market, but you have big oligopolies, monopolies, Amazon, Tesla, Google governing the market. But it's not like that yet, I would say, especially not in our parts of the world. But I also don't think that it's the end of capitalism. I think it's definitely something worse. Definitely there is no free market. You know, neoliberalism as such doesn't actually exist in that way, because you can see that all these monopolies very often take subsidies from the state. They need the state actually in order to create more profit. I mean, Elon Musk is flying to Mars, not to Mars, but to space for now, luckily, mainly thanks to NASA and huge state subsidies. So in that sense, neoliberalism doesn't really exist. But yeah, I stop here. I still see some hope. Maybe we can talk about that. But I would say that the situation is actually much worse than 2 years ago. It helped to serve the monopolies, to gain even more power. It also helped, I'm not conspiracy, don't take me wrong, but it accelerated the technological the integration of different sorts of technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, but biometry, these kinds of platforms we use now for public programs and so on. It accelerated it even further. So we are in a very interesting situation, which is quite dangerous because of the control which exists.
Thank you so much, Srécko. I also prepared 3 questions, but because we're a bit pressed of time, I will maybe save one for the Q&A section, and I would save it because it somehow relates very well with what you just talked about. And moreover, I wanted to ask you about the Green New Deal and the fact that you built your perspective on a very specific type of concept of justice. And I would actually like to hear you talk about that and to provoke the philosopher in you to discuss a bit the tradition to which you refer. But I will leave that question if there's time for the Q&A session. And now I would like to take you a bit back, and also in another register, referring to an older book of yours. I think it's from 2015, the book The Radicality of Love. A wonderful book that's written, and you appeal in it to various, again, registers. You make reference to cinema, to literature, to very heterogeneous philosophical traditions and ideas, and it's a very compelling reading, that book. And regarding the discussion that you put forward in The Radicality of Love, and also because the theme, the future of love, it's again a theme of the project from Reactor, I would like to ask you to maybe go into detail regarding this intertwining of love and revolution. And you discuss in the book the fact that you talk about a radical form of love that hinges on a radical conceptualization of revolution and universality, that you very astutely counterpose to the cold intimacy that Eva Illouz discussing, that characterizes this emotional culture of capitalism. And regarding that, how is the reinvention of love possible? Maybe also thinking about the things that might have changed in the last year since you published that book. And more precisely, for you, this radical love, is it a presupposition for revolution or vice versa, a precondition of emancipatory politics or a finality of it? And if you can a bit expand on this theme that I know completely changes the register, but I think it's also maybe, I don't know, conclusion on a more, I don't know, positive or at least humane note than the one from before.
Yeah, I think it's definitely connected to everything what we were talking about, because what I saw also in my own activist experience, but also studying and studying radical political theory or philosophy or even practice was that curiously, I would say after the period of 68, the topic of love was, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but it wasn't that much prevailing as it was during the previous decades. And what I was interested in the radicality of love was how different revolutionaries or different revolutionary periods approached the most intimate sphere, whether it's motherhood, whether it's family relations, whether it's sexual desire, or what, of course, in French theory they would call libidinal economy. In which way different revolutionary periods or leaders related to the libidinal economy. And it's very interesting because you will often see that those whom you maybe put on a pedestal and thought the best of them very often failed a lot in recreating or reinventing love. One of them is definitely Lenin, for instance, who had a big quarrel with Alexandra Kollontai, and their different perceptions of love, and in which way love is whether a finale or, as you put it, a condition of revolution. For me, it's definitely a condition for any sort of social change, if we want, of course, a positive, at least in our mind, a positive social change which would bring more equality and fairness or justice to different members, to all members of society. Then it has to be a condition of it. And then it's also a much broader term than just merely love, because I think what we have to include in this is, of course, also comradeship, which is in a way different than friendship, but also friendship, mutual aid, solidarity, different concepts which I think are necessary conditions for reinventing a social transformation as well. Or to put it differently, if we are not able to reinvent ourselves and to already create those social relations which we want to see in the future society, if we are not able to do it today, then it's a big question whether we will be able to do it tomorrow after the revolution, And very often, if you look at history, it was proven to be like that. If you didn't think deeply about these questions, then very often later you would reach a fiasco. But also, if you did think deeply about these questions, I mean, Alexandra Kollontai is the best example. How with the October Revolution, homosexuality is permitted, divorce becomes legal, which wasn't legal, of course. It was very difficult, especially for women, to get a divorce during the previous period, where kindergartens were established, where this concept of care was actually in a way invented, and that care is not something which you can leave to the private sector, but the state has to provide this sort of care, so that a mother or a wife or a single mother can actually have time to develop, whether it's educationally or socially or what other way, that the state takes over parts of your motherhood in a way. I mean, this was all already, these discussions existed before the October Revolution. And it's very interesting that nowadays, maybe it's not so present anymore, at least not in some of the movements or in the main narrative of those movements. Although, of course, there are a lot of practitioners, thinkers, and so on who are thinking that direction. Yeah, what did I want to say? I think it's still an important topic, but coming back to your previous question about and probably the most important topic, coming back to your question about the pandemic, what I see is that in the last 7 years since this book was published, what I call commodification of emotions, or what Eva Illouz calls emotional capitalism, or instead of commodities, she talks about emodities. I think that rapidly also went into direction of a dystopia. I've read the recent statistics of dating apps. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's really shocking. Well, not shocking for me, because I kind of expected this trend, the rise of the use of dating apps during the pandemic. I mean, you can probably either you do it or your friends do it or whatever, but the statistics is really, how many more people are actually using it, because obviously you had conditions of lockdowns, isolations, and so on. And it was pretty convenient to find a date or just a fun buddy or whatever via these platforms. And I think it presents a real danger because you have, again, monopolies having power over a platform, which actually can lead to the most important consequences of your life, you know, whether it's falling in love with someone or it's having a very bad date. It happens through the platforms, and these platforms, platform capitalism nowadays owns everything, you know, and is penetrating into all aspects of our lives, whether it's food delivery. I don't know how it is in Romania or how it was before, but in Croatia during the pandemic, and especially now after the pandemic, it's almost impossible that you can, like in the good old times, call a restaurant and say, "Hi man, how are you? Can I order a pizza?" That's impossible. You have to use a platform by a foreign company which doesn't pay taxes in your country. And I would say, if you take these different phenomenons together, and then also dating apps, you will see that Silicon Valley, and I'm not saying China is better, but it's also definitely not worse or more dangerous than our current system, which is not that visible, that these platforms are actually taking over all aspects of our lives. And what they are doing is actually accelerating this concept of love, or falling in love, which is being treated as a commodity, which is commodified. You know, it's almost like a free market. You can pick up everyone you want, and it's a constant reinvention of yourself, but in a bad way. You know, Maurizio Lazzarati, a very interesting philosopher, coined the term of the self-employer or something like that. You know, you basically create a business from your own self. I mean, and that's what you can see in Instagram or all these young stars and so on, because everything becomes commodification. Your music taste already on Facebook became commodification. You show what you love to listen and so on. And basically they show that artificial intelligence today, just measuring the likes on Facebook, can guess your spouse or perfect match or whatever better than humans themselves, you know, very often. And I think that represents a big danger, that technologies which don't have to be bad necessarily and can be used for a good cause are owned by the 1%, to put it in that populist way, but are owned by oligopolies who are now also going after our emotions, desire, and so on. And just to conclude, this is not something particularly new. Because what I write about in the book is how totalitarian systems very often actually went exactly for the libidinal economy. You know, whether it's Khomeini in Iran, who prohibited dancing, homosexual relations, of course, music, everything which is connected to desire, to Stalin, you know, who revoked all the laws which were introduced by Alexandra Kollontai, prohibited homosexuality in 1933 again, and on all other things. But what we have today is basically capitalism taking over the economy of desire, and that's very dangerous, I think, for anyone who really wants to fall in love or maintain a relationship, or to use love as a radical category, as a political category, which I think is very useful and very important today.
Yes, this is a very interesting discussion. I really enjoy the Q&A and the topics that you addressed. We have to stop here. We have now around 25 minutes for Q&A from the audience, and in this respect, I kindly ask you to raise your hands and turn your camera on so that we can record the intervention.
No one, everyone disappeared.
No, they are still here, but they are just a bit shy.
I will break the ice if that's okay, because I'm, of course, not only the fact that we have these big themes in our project about the future of love that has already been addressed, but also the future of work and the future in general somehow, because I think all of it is connected. But I wanted to go back a bit to something that you said, Srécko, because you said that there is hope in your opinion, but at the same time, from everything that I've heard so far, it's getting worse. So I think it's a more philosophical question, maybe. Is it a coping mechanism to think about our future in these terms of hope? Like we need to have hope because otherwise I'm not sure if there's a good solution for us, or is this maybe realistic approach that of course we feel that it's getting worse, and what do we do about it? I'm not asking for solutions, but I'm really curious of how do you explain this contradiction between hope and the fact that capitalism and not only get us to to this point where we know that it's getting worse, not better. And of course, the pandemic has a big contribution to this.
Yeah, it's a topic close to my heart. I mean, both in theory and in practice. So in Poetry from the Future, I was actually not stealing, but I took a concept of Terry Eagleton, which I quite admire and love personally, but also politically, where he talks about hope without optimism. And I think hope is definitely a very important concept. But optimism, I mean, to be very direct, is a very problematic, I would say, attitude towards life. In the same way, pessimism is also very problematic and can be very difficult. So hope without optimism basically means that hope is an important political category. You could have seen it these days in Chile, for instance. In order to have this kind of historical action in Chile, you need to work with people's hopes, to put it like that. But on the other side, I think, as you said, yes, of course, I mean, what is prevailing today, but that's precisely why I think hope is important, is something what Walter Benjamin would call left-wing melancholia, which doesn't have to be left at all. But this kind of melancholy where you stick to the lost object and you cannot mourn the lost object, but you keep returning to it. In climate science, for instance, you have the concept of solastalgia, which is a concept of mourning, let's say, the place where you are at the very moment, because you see that it's disappearing. So it's not lost yet, but you already have a melancholy as if it is already lost, precisely because you are losing it in front of your eyes. And I think in this kind of context where we are daily in this kind of melancholy, and especially with the pandemic, which is creating all sorts of psychological problems, you know, from depression to narcissism to you name it, paranoia. I mean, it's everything, but it creates serious psychological problems, especially for the kids, or for people who for 1 or 2 years didn't have any kind of proper, not just education, but the socializing which comes together with education. Similar to this event now, which is my fault. I could have been there physically, but maybe not. I mean, now the situation, of course, the pandemic is not finished yet. But I think, to come back to your question, we definitely need, I still think we need to still use the concept, the category of hope, and to see what we can do with this category and what we can do with this aspiration towards a future which would be different than our dystopian present. And if you don't have this category, I'm asking myself the question, how can you actually mobilize people to do anything in life if they don't have a hope that it might be better? So, but I'm very opposed both to optimism and pessimism, because I think it just leads to a one-way street, or to either to constant disappointment or to constant depression, you know. So, and that's definitely not the way out.
Thank you. If there are any other questions?
Well, if there aren't, maybe I can also ask you the question that I left for the Q&A part. And this again relates to the, the small thing that we have in the room, namely the end of the world, in relation to climate change. And I saw from your interviews and articles published in various very read newspapers and journals, that you advocate for a Green New Deal that puts in the center the question of or at least at some point you did, that puts at its center a certain concept of justice that you connect. And this is the part that I like with the issue of migration. So maybe even if your stance on the Green New Deal has changed, maybe I think the question of migration still stands because it is a very pressing dimension. So regarding this, I would like to maybe ask you on what side are you on, in which paradigm do you situate yourself when it comes to the discussion of climate change? And as I said, maybe even if your opinions have changed, go into the detail regarding that concept of justice that you use, namely on what philosophical tradition does it rest, and what kind of political action can it materialize it in the end? And this is the last question, because this is the left and we thrive on the polemics between us. How do you stand in relation to this debate regarding degrowth and other propositions coming from the left? Because it is like this, it's a polemic that I think it's very interesting to the public, but also it is of interest in general. And mostly I would like to hear in what way has your position changed from what I've read. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I have been an advocate of the Green New Deal in the early days of the Green New Deal, to put it like that. And also the movement, DiEM25, Democracy in Europe movement, was and still is advocating for a Green New Deal in Europe, with the idea that public money should be spent on a green transition, put it like that. And also in DiEM's Green New Deal, you have very clearly stated that the periphery cannot be the one which will take the burden of the green transition. So Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Hungary, all those countries which are in a way underdeveloped or not that developed compared to the development program of Western Europe, that they shouldn't carry the burden of the green transition. But in the meantime, I think what happened is that, as usually what happens very often, is that a narrative, a political idea, on the one hand, was at the same time being created by different groups or social movements around the world. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, the Greens all over Europe, different left movements as well, were kind of adopting the concept of the Green New Deal, or leading figures from the left, including Naomi Klein or others as well. But I think at the same time, what was happening with this kind of, I would say, spreading of the Green New Deal theory, which was then turned into a kind of politics or political requests. What you had is, of course, a lot of greenwashing and green capitalism also taking it over. I mean, the best example, of course, is the current Green Deal by the European Union, which, of course, interestingly left out the new out of the Green New Deal. So it's just a Green Deal, and it's definitely not sufficient. And also, I think the biggest problem of green capitalism as such, which is now taking over the very green narrative, I would say,
is that decoupling paradigm.
Excuse me?
A new decoupling, it's being proposed, from the absolute decoupling, here we have a green decoupling.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. And it's very difficult actually to navigate yourself these days, I would say. But I would say that, any Green New Deal which wants to be worth of its name has to take into account what you said, a certain concept of justice, if you put it like that, not only taking into account periphery and center, like in the European context, but also take into account not only historical examples of colonialism and imperialism, but current practices of colonialism and imperialism, which are happening exactly because of the so-called green transition. For instance, I mentioned already the case of Serbia, in which way you use a periphery country for the extraction of minerals which will serve the Green New Deal in other countries, more developed countries. But there is also the example of Bolivia and coup d'etats or in Latin America, or the civil war in Congo, which is ongoing because of the minerals which we need to produce more electronics, to put it like that. So I think, you know, the Green New Deal has reached a certain impasse, definitely, I would say, even theoretical one, but especially political one, which would lead us then, as you said, in the degrowth discussion, because if you have a green left government or whatever, it obviously has to make a choice, or it is forced to make a choice whether it will remain extractivist or not. So, for instance, if you take different governments of Latin America, which are very often taken as an inspiration among left movements, you will see that many of them remain extractivist. You know, it's the state nationalizing resources, but they are still extracting resources. And the real question is, how can you not do it? You know, how can you stop doing it? Which would then go into the degrowth direction. For instance, I mean, I don't have a given answer. I must warn you immediately. Serbia, they say, now has one of the biggest reserves of lithium. I don't know whether in Europe or in the world, but let's say they have one of the biggest reserves of lithium in Europe. Vučić falls down. Of course, that sounds like science fiction. He's not the leader, the president, the premier, whatever, prime minister of Serbia anymore. And the left-green coalition comes to power in Serbia. Let's say that might actually happen in 5 years or whatever, but not that soon. What do they do with the reserves of lithium? You know, what do they do with the concept of extractivist capitalism which exists there? Or, you know, also there is no socialist system in history which was not extractivist. They were using fossil fuels, of course, or other resources. So I think that's really a serious question for the left and the Greens. You know, how to cope with the reality of realpolitik. You know, in a situation where you come to power in a country which has vast resources, what do you do with them? In which way do you govern the resources? Do you continue extracting the resources or not? Like in the case of Serbia, you know that you are sitting on a lot of lithium or other minerals which are leading to the production of lithium. What do you do with it? Is it sufficient to nationalize it, like some countries in Latin America did? And then instead of private companies, the state owns the means of production and it governs it, but it still remains extractivist. So regarding degrowth, I definitely find, you know, this direction of thinking and politics very inspiring, especially on the local level. I think it's much easier to do it on the local level, you know, than to experiment with permaculture or with different sorts of agriculture, which you can do on the local level. But on the global level, as long as we live, and that was the biggest problem for socialist Yugoslavia, how we started the conversation, you know, even if you have a socialist system like Yugoslavia, in the 70s, it was already fully integrated in the globalist market, in global capitalism, you know. And if you're in this context, for instance, everyone is extractivist, everyone else is using lithium, those who are lucky or unlucky to have it, and you have it, and what are you doing in that situation? I mean, I don't have a given answer, but I think it's difficult to solve it, you know. I think as long as there is a global capitalist system, it is very difficult to go in the degrowth direction. Even, you know, if a particular country goes in degrowth direction, what does it exactly mean for the rest of the global capitalist system? Or how do you force the rest to go in that direction? I mean, that's why I'm personally very active in different internationalist movements, because I think that internationalism is the only answer. Like, I don't believe that, you know, progressive taxation like Piketty proposes, for instance, or regulation of big tech, which some liberals in the United States propose, that this is the answer, because I think as long as you don't have a systemic structural change, a planetary change, any of these changes you cannot really enact, you know. You cannot really just have progressive taxation in a very progressive country. I mean, capital flows will just fly wherever they want into another oasis. Or if you as a country go degrowth, the whole neighborhood is not changed. So I don't know, what do you think? I don't really have an answer to this. I think it's fair to say that we don't have an answer, because I think the Green New Deal is definitely not, you know, this magic stick with which you will change and turn into a, you know, a universe of green transition. But I think what is our duty is to pose questions and to find contradictions in something which sounds like a good plan, but I think it remains too Keynesian, and it definitely doesn't take into account. I mean, it would be beautiful if we had Keynesianism or social democracy today. Of course, it would be better than this hell, but that's definitely not radical politics. So, yeah, I don't know. What do you think about how does this discussion look like in Romania when it comes to degrowth and, well, the Green New Deal?
I think there are a lot of sides also here, and it's a very complicated answer to give. And I think people just do like you do, namely they look at the support for various paradigms, and there is a lot of support, in this this green growth paradigm. There are a lot of types of capital that are supporting this, and that means institutions and stuff like that. But there's also, like a movement that comes from the side of green capital that goes towards some sort of a model that's reforming, that aims towards the reformation of capitalists, because I don't think it can be taxed out of existence. I think the super rich class can be taxed out of existence, but with capital, it's more complicated. On the other hand, it's also the discussion of building a social base to sustain a paradigm. And this is very complicated because here some truth needs to be told, namely that mostly everybody, irrespective of the class, will have to bear the brunt of this, I don't know, the changes that need to be implemented. And honestly, when it comes to me, I just think that we'll be faced with some disasters, and then we'll have some options in front of us. And I think it's going to be, again, very local, eco-Leninism, eco-fascism, and some intermediate models depending on the place. Honestly, this is how I think it's going to be. I am afraid that we're not going to be able to come up with a global solution in time. It's just going to be, but I don't know, I'm not...
Very hopeful.
Please don't reply to that. This is a very interesting conversation, but we're running out of time. Lolo has a question, so go ahead, Lolo.
Hello, thank you for this discussion. I'm really glad that this happened, and nice meeting you, Srécko. This opens a lot of topics, which I really hope that we'll have other occasion to follow up. But I just wanted to share with you my memories from university occupation here in Romania, which was very important for political subjectifications, if we may say so, and forging solidarities between different people and different groups, and to which, at least for the occupation in Cluj, and at least for a part of us, the Zagreb University occupation from 2009 served in a way as a guide or something like that. And I'm curious if you, Srécko, know about this kind of connection, and because you, Dana, and Sorin are involved in sociology department, I'm wondering how you, the three of you, find the university status now, if can still represent a context for this kind of public manifestation or this kind of public request.
Yeah, first, of course, I'm aware of what was happening in Romania. I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but I see parallels. I didn't know that it was inspired by the happening.
Sorry, literally, it was I think when, I mean, not only, but I think the moment when the police came was when this documentary Blocada was about to be projected, and that was actually the night that then the occupation actually happened pragmatically. So it's a quite a cool connection.
Yeah, it's I'm smiling because it's done by a very dear close friend of mine called Igor Bezinovic, who took a team of a few people, and for 30 days he was filming the blockade, which was completely mad, because when he had to edit the material, he had 200 hours or something, which is, if you know anything about movies or editing, this is hell if you have so much material. But in the end, I think it's a great movie. And yeah, it actually went around. I think it was also shown at Occupy Wall Street. Actually, when I was at Occupy Wall Street in 2011, I found the Blokad na Kuharica, the cookbook of the blockade, with the anarchist cookbook, but it was the blockade cookbook where you can find recipes and so on. So they were actually reading it at Occupy Wall Street as well. Yeah, I find interesting this these connections. And your question, I think, is more pertinent, about the university today. These days, I've been very sad to see that the students of the Faculty of Philosophy in Zagreb, for instance, were collecting signatures against corona measures or something like that. So there's a lot of conspiracy at the universities these days, and it shows how politics, from the radical politics, shifted in a way as well. But I think definitely universities are the space of political subjectivation and potential social transformations still, although I think the university is in a much worse shape since the days when I was studying, for instance, which was 20 years ago now. Sound like a grandpa. But these days, especially with the Bologna reform and with the commodification of education, I think it's became an environment which just became a kind of, again, as Lazzarato said, you have yourself, you put it into the machine of the university, and then you hope that miraculously you will find a job on the job market. I mean, that's the narrative, at least in transitional post-socialist countries, where the university serves only the purpose of finding a job on a market which doesn't exist anymore, of course. So it's completely ridiculous. I mean, at the times when I was studying, at least there was this idea that, close to German idealism and, this classic idea of education from Fichte and onwards, that education was the purpose itself. It wasn't a mean. And I think this is the kind of education which we have to reinvent, that you're not studying in order to get a degree or to get a job. You're studying because of education itself, because of the questions you want to answer to yourself or arrive to new questions. And I think this kind of critical education is so important. Very often universities are not doing the job. That's why we need organizations such as Reactor or other ones, alternative models of education. Recently I started to deal a bit more in a, let's say, fundamental way with the work of Ivan Ilić, who incidentally comes from, his father from the island of Brač in Croatia, but who founded this school in Cuernavaca, which is like 1 or 2 hours away from Mexico City, in the 60s and the 70s, where all those representatives of critical pedagogy from Freire and others were coming to Erich Fromm and others, with the idea that we have to actually do not schooling but deschooling, which doesn't mean to completely abolish the schools, but it means actually to deconstruct the very praxis, but also the underlying ideology of education today. And according to Ivan Ilić, education, that was in the 70s, today it's even worse, serves the class interests of those who are in power, to put it like that, and that's even more is the case today, I would say. And that's why I think we have to reinvent, use the university as much as you can, especially if you're an assistant professor or student, use the resources you can get there, use the money you can use for research and so on. But I think at the same time, we have the duty, especially people like me who are not part of the academia, to reinvent education outside of the current model, commodified model of education.
Okay, thank you. Dana has a short intervention and we will conclude our discussion with this.
Thank you, Sorin. It's just that Laurent's question, it was so nice, and I wanted to say something because an analogy came to mind. We're discussing earlier about the difference between regarding nature, and basically what environmental economy says is that nature is like a subsystem of economy and can be fixed through a technical invention that somehow will realize the absolute decoupling. Whereas on the other side, the most socialist or ecological approaches that say that society is part of nature and that economy is a subsystem of society, not the vice versa. And regarding education, this is also my problem. I can accept, the fact that education and economy are interdependent. I can accept that. It's just that, I don't know, I feel that we are going towards a paradigm in which education becomes a subsystem of the economy. And this really pisses me off because also I grew up, in the remnants of the socialist and enlightened way of perceiving education, that is a gold it is a goal in itself, and we need to return to that. You know, I know it sounds very Kantian, but I think this is the way to go, because otherwise it's just this commodification of education means basically education as a mean to achieve, like, I don't know, a certain position on the labor market, not to mention the interventions that are becoming more and more increased and more aggressive on the economy, from the, I don't know, business environment, in the way the education system is structured. And I think the two problems are not completely separated. And I think solving one will also point the way of solving the other, or not. That is what I wanted to say. And thank you, Sorin, for allowing me for this minute.
Yeah, great. I fully agree with you, and I'm glad to see that you're pissed off. I think everyone should be pissed off with this current situation. That's the first step.
Well, I think that's a good conclusion. While thinking about our future, to be pissed off about what's going to happen next. Maybe this.
Yeah, I think if I can, how to say, correct myself, being pissed off is much better than having hope and hoping that the situation will get better, you know. But yeah.
Okay, so being pissed off, it's also revolutionary, I think. Well, I think we have to end our talk. I think we gave ourselves a very, very big theme to discuss, and it cannot be fulfilled in 1 hour and a half. I think it's very difficult to talk about the future just having this amount of time. But I just wanted to thank you all for joining us, and thanking you, Srécko, for accepting again our invitation, and to Dana and Sorin for being part of this and moderating the whole conversation. I don't know if you want to add any conclusion, but I just wanted to thank you again.
Yeah, I would also. I mean, I don't have much to add. It would take hours, but I would love to thank you, Sorin and Dana, and everyone who was part of this today. I think we had an inspiring exchange, and next time I'll pose you questions about your specific context in Romania, because I've been several times to Romania, and I would love to find out more. But well, this wasn't the format today, but next time.
Thank you for
payback time.
Payback time, yes. Thank you, Srécko. Srécko, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's very important to have discussions about what's going on in Eastern Europe, in our region, and see what type of critical theories developed here in relationship to the specific economic, social problems that we have. So it was really nice listening to you and reading your books and interviews.